All right, my friends, last time we spoke, we ended with talking about Don Quixote leaving the Sierra Morena in the company of one Dorotea, who had taken on the figure of a shepherd, very like Marcella, as well as one Cardenio. We called it the priest and the barber had met Sancho back in La Mancha, that they demanded that he take them to the Sierra Morena to retrieve poor crazy Don Quixote. On the way there, they run into a shepherdess with beautiful feet, with long hair. Turns out that she is a gender-bending shepherdess, just like Marcella. It is a woman in the guise of a man, and so again, we see a fictional character in disguise, and yet we are introduced to her first in story and then in disguise. And this is our first time actually seeing this lady, Dorotea, as it turns out. She then immediately, because of the conniving of the priest and the barber, takes a new disguise. She will no longer be a shepherd. She will no longer be Dorotea. She will now be Princess Micomicona, who has been deeply wronged by the giant Hondo Philando, in which I gave you a small etymology of for Hon, like Hunter Ray, which is a very famous quote from Heraclitus, a pre-Socratic philosopher, which means all things flow, or to let's see, no, we have things like the Pan-Americas. That means like all Americas, as it were. And then philanderer means to love men specifically, but to be a lover of humans. In fact, philandering is, it can be sort of a less vulgar term for homosexual love between men as well, sort of like sodomy, can also be that sort of term. In any case, however, I encourage you to see the connections between Princess Micomicona, Hondo Philando, and Dorothea and Don Fernando. Is this a case of, say, psychoanalytic, sort of unconscious telling a story from one's imagination that in fact actually reflects one's life itself? The names are changed, but the roles between these individuals seem fairly similar. That is sort of a scholarly literary point that gets made by some individuals. In any case, this Princess Micomicona with the priest, the barber, and then Cardenio, who is also picked up in a moment of lucidity, travel back with Sancho and Don Quixote towards La Mancha. Princess Micomicona enlists the help of Don Quixote. She says, "You will be my knight, but you must swear not to take any additional quests on while you are my knight," which actually itself leads to various funny hijinks, like him not helping out an innkeeper first because he promised not to engage in any additional quests, but second because the innkeeper is not or the people who are fighting the innkeeper are not themselves noble knights, and so he is not permitted by the laws of chivalry to fight. In fact, he's called coward because of that. But Princess Micomicona says that her kingdom is actually straight. One has to go straight through La Mancha in order to get to it. And so they all start to head back to La Mancha. This is obviously a story confabulated in order to take Don Quixote back home. On the way back to their home from the Sierra Morena, they run into the same inn that has been defined as a castle by Don Quixote once before, the one that has Maricones and Juan Calamaque in it, the exact same inn where Sancho was thrown flying through the air. The interesting essay for you to talk about times that he flies through the air. There's a second part. In the second part of the novel, one of the more famous moments is when he rides on a wooden donkey named Pablo and claims that he sees all the Pleiades and all the goats in the sky. He sees all the constellations, and he says that they have different colors and such. And yet they're only on the ground. So one wonders how sane Sancho is by the end of the second part. Is he being affected by Don Quixote? On the way back to the end, so they make it back to the end. All right. There at the end, make sure that I move this. And I already talked about a couple of these things. Back at the end, Don Quixote grills between chapters 31 and 32 Sancho about what Dulcinea looked like. Obviously, Sancho did not take the letter to Dulcinea nor find Dulcinea before he was found and picked up by the priest and the barber. So he cannot describe how beautiful she smells. He says she smelled like sweat. Don Quixote says he must have been smelling himself. He couldn't have. He says she was winnowing or threshing wheat. That's obviously not what she could have been doing. She must have been embroidering. So you see how even confronted with facts, which are themselves fabrications made up by Sancho, Don Quixote does not accept what is said by Sancho, who ostensibly has firsthand experience, though he doesn't, and continues to reject his own ideas of what Dulcinea is, even in the wake of disconfirming evidence. Very interesting stuff. One thing that we run into at the very end of part one is a little bit of literary criticism. We've done this over and over again, and we get Don Quixote's ideas on what it means to be a warrior, what it means to be, say, a judge, what it means to be a commercial agent, a business person, as it were. But we also get two distinct moments where we hear about perceptions of chivalry. We have the innkeeper, who's himself sort of a person. He is a person of commerce, but he is a person not of great education. He is himself illiterate. It turns out that there are 3 books of chivalry at his home, and he loves them. Later in the very last chapters of part 1, when Don Quixote finds himself incarcerated in an ox cart, a canon, which is sort of like higher level, there are all these levels of priests, Catholic priests, and Catholicism is a very bureaucratic religion, but particularly at this time in the 17th century, canon's like a little bit, definitely higher than the curate priest, who is the local priest of Don Quixote's province. I guess we would say parish. This canon also engages in literary criticism with Don Quixote, and he said that he doesn't really like works of chivalry because they're made of nonsense and they muddle people's minds. It's a very interesting claim given what has happened to Don Quixote himself. Okay, at this end, it is overstating it a little bit and engaging in what we call hyperbaton in the or hyperbole in the profession to say that everything starts to happen here. But many of the threads that we have seen come back together, many of the threads that we have not seen come back together in this end. What do I mean? All right, and I have to check just an extra note because I have so many notes that I don't know which ones to look at all times. But so, for example, we are reintroduced to several characters that we met along the way. On the way back to the end, we find out that the only person who, or excuse me, at the end, the only person that returned to Dulcinea supposedly was the Basque, the Biscayan, the person that cut off a piece of Don Quixote's ear. Who else do we run into? We find Andres, the person who was being beaten, whipped mercilessly by his master, and he says, no matter what, even if you ever see me again, if I'm getting my head cut off, don't come to save me because whatever's happening is better than what will happen as a result of you helping me. We see Ginés de Pasamonte on the way back, and Sancho is able to get his donkey back from him. And in fact, we also see the barber from whom Don Quixote took the helm of Mambrino, the barber's basin. Something you may wish to know is that the image, not this helmet, which is an actual helmet, the helmet that Don Quixote is often represented as wearing, that looks like sort of a flat-brimmed hat going around, that's a barber's basin. The helmet he's usually wearing is in fact a barber's basin. It's a small detail that you should know. All right, so we run into all these characters again, and the barber is then paid, I believe, 8 reales by the priest for his basin. Also, the innkeeper's wife, she had what was used for the priest's beard for his disguise is returned to her, as well as I believe a pack saddle as well. And there's some debate about whether it's a pack saddle or something else, which is one of the modernistic elements of this book. What is real and what is what? Is this a helmet? Is this a basin? Is a thing determined by its form or by its function? Because if you're using an object as a basin, it can be a basin according to functionalism. But if you then turn it into a hat and it works just fine as a hat, then it's also a hat, regardless of its form. Interesting sort of claim there. So these are several characters that are looped back in. But we still have a couple outstanding situations and 2 or 3 additional situations that come to the fore while we are here. Okay, so first and foremost, it turns out that there is an additional book at the innkeeper's home. And it comprises 3 chapters in the first 52 chapters of part 1. The 52 chapters of part 1 is called the novel of the man who was recklessly curious. And I mentioned that this is to some extent based on a story by Herodotus. I misstated Croesus, who's known to be a very rich king. It was actually Candales, who showed his beautiful wife in the nude to his advisor, but she saw that this happened, and she demanded that the advisor either kill the king and become her husband, or be killed by the king, so that only her husband would have seen her in the nude. So great was the shame that she knew about this. In this novel, The Man Who Was Recklessly Curious, there are 2 great friends, Lothario and Anselmo. They're called los dos amigos, the 2 friends, because they're such good friends. And it happens to be the case that Anselmo really is in love with Camilla, and in fact the love is brokered by his good friend Lothario, and then they become married. However, Anselmo did not realize that upon becoming married, that his friend, in order to do honor to him, would start hanging out with him less and less and less. And this is sort of sad thing about transitioning in one's life, that relations that were perhaps one's primary relations, say like during college, your roommate or your best friend, all of a sudden they take a second place often when you find a long-term relationship and somebody with whom you have to bear the current responsibilities of your lives. And this may or may not happen with you, but this is something that does happen with these characters. Anselmo is upset by this, but then he comes up with this scheme, and it's very much foolish. Because his wife has not had to prove her chastity and virtue, she has not had somebody attempt to seduce her, he wants to challenge her to withstand seduction. And from whom? Well, Anselmo's best friend, Lothario. And Lothario tries to demur. He says, no, I'm not going to do this. This is foolish. There's no good reason for doing this. You gain nothing. You just potentially lose something from this. And something to keep in mind with a decision. A bad decision is one where you gain nothing and potentially lose something. That's not a good thing to choose to do. In any case, eventually Lothario agrees. And since I don't have a lot of time, I just have to say this in broad outline. Camilla gives in to him. And this is only discovered after the maid of Camilla, who has herself taken a lover, is discovered to have a lover in her room by Anselmo. Anselmo then demands that she tell the truth about what's going on. And she says, I'm going to tell you something a lot more interesting than the fact that I have a lover. The next day, Anselmo comes to find out the truth. And it turns out that his maid has fled, his wife has fled, and so has Lothario. He then becomes ill due to sadness and dies. Great ending for his life. And do you think that he's happy that he engaged in that particular experiment? Probably not. The priest at the end of hearing this book says that he dislikes the book, but does not find it displeasing. Let's see. And it turns out that Camilla goes to a convent at the end of this, and Lothario dies in battle in Naples, very like Lord Byron, and his going through a thunderstorm and dying in Greece. All right. At the end of this story, in fact, Sancho interrupts the very end to say that Don Quixote has just attacked and killed the giant panda Philando. Even though he's supposed to be something like 2,000 miles or leagues away, it turns out that Don Quixote, while asleep, had a dream that he was fighting Panda Philando. And at the head of his bed was a giant wineskin. So he takes his sword and he slashes the wineskin. All the red wine goes across the ground, and Sancho claims that it's blood. The innkeeper becomes extremely upset at Don Quixote. Again, Don Quixote is wasting his time and wasting his money by destroying things in the innkeeper's house with his insanity. And Don Quixote himself thinks that an enchanter has moved the giant to his room. And you can see how using an enchanter as a conceit is a conceit that can be used for almost anything. Please do silence your phone since it keeps going off. And so Panda Philando has been transported to his room and then has been turned into a wineskin after having been killed by Don Quixote, because this inn, where so many hijinks has happened, is a place of enchantment. In fact, an enchanted castle, according to Don Quixote. All right. And this is where we get a fantastic moment. 2 new travelers with several sort of henchmen show up here in masks. But when they speak, Cardenio realizes who they are. Who are these new travelers? They are Don Fernando and Lucinda. Now we know that Dorotea and Cardenio are already in the party with the priest and the barber. They were collected from the Sierra Morena and near the Sierra Morena. And in fact, Dorotea was collected in order to play a role to help seduce Don Quixote into returning to his own home. We see Lucinda, whom we know was wronged by Don Fernando, and Don Fernando, who we know has wronged Dorotea. So what happened here? This small correction here. We left the marriage of Lucinda knowing that Cardenio had fainted, knowing that Lucinda had a letter and a knife on her. That knife was to commit suicide with, not homicide. And in fact, when Don Fernando finds those things on her, he considers killing her, but her parents intervene. She then goes to a convent to avoid Don Fernando because she considers herself married to Cardenio. Don Fernando, using his great rank and resources, goes to the convent and tears her away from it. And so now she is with him as something like his wife prisoner. And now they are here. So now Cardenio, Lucinda, Dorotea, and Don Fernando are all in each other's presence. But one thing that complicates them revealing themselves to each other is the fact that Dorotea is still playing the role of Princess Micomicona, which Don Quixote still believes in, though Sancho will say a little bit later, after the denouement of this particular situation, that that she's seen Dorotea and Don Fernando kissing each other, and so this queen has been acting rather unqueenly. And one wonders to what extent Sancho there is himself becoming deluded and enmeshed in the delusions of his master and incapable of seeing the situation for what it really is. All right, so Sancho is told that Princess Micomicona is actually the woman Dorotea, and this is something sad to him because in the presence of Princess Micomicona, he was very sure, that Don Quixote should attempt to marry her rather than Dulcinea, because though he misquotes this quote, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, as it were. Don Quixote, in marrying a princess, would be sure to get some sort of land and then would be able to give a reward to Sancho, an actual reward as far as Sancho is concerned, whereas Dulcinea, Sancho still hasn't even seen her and seems to be starting to question how real that which Don Quixote pursues is. He's a little bit too free with his language when he does this, when he says this, and he then he makes sure to, he's a little unclear with his language. Let's see, Giants, Don Quixote, Ortez. Excuse me, in any case. Oh yes, Sancho is a little bit too free with his language and criticizes Dulcinea in front of Don Quixote. And this is a moment where he pushes the relationship of Squire to Barber Knight just a little bit too far. They are, I think if we look in great outline, actually friends and neighbors. But in the context of the fictional situation that they are acting like is real, one is knight, one is squire, Sancho is supposed to treat Don Quixote with great respect, treat that which Don Quixote venerates with great respect as well. This is not something that Sancho has demonstrated by potentially insulting Dulcinea, and so he is reminded of their differing roles by two lance strikes on the back by Don Quixote, and apparently they're very strong as well. Okay. After Dorotea and Don Fernando are revealed to Lucinda and Cardenio, Don Fernando considers slaying Lucinda. However, Dorotea runs to his knees and supplicates him and says, let Lucinda and Cardenio be together, because Lucinda had promised herself to Cardenio. You can see this is very much like a romance, a modern romance. And Dorotea says, also mitigate your anger against the fact that you had promised, when seducing me, to love and marry me. So really, if you think about it, they're getting what they want and are due, and you are also getting what is due to you given your oaths, and what is due to me given the oaths that you have given to me. And things seem to start to work out. The two final situations I have to mention before we really finish, because the wrapping is even tighter than this. Two new characters then show up, a man and a woman that is described as even more beautiful than Lucinda and Dorothea, and they are themselves described as rather comely. This woman's name is Zoraida. She's a Moorish or Muslim woman, and she herself has a tale that comes with her. It's called Captive's Tale, chapters 38 to 42, and is in fact based on itself a real story, and also the actual imprisonment of Cervantes. Oh yes, here's some detail that I need to correct. I said that his family raised the money for him to be bought out of slavery. It was in fact a collection of priests that did it. But in any case, this story is based on this Rui Perez describes his honorable family background in Leon, his modest financial resources, and his decision to find fortune as a member of the imperial army. So this is like a fairy tale. There were three brothers, and they had a father who was aging and had to divide his resources for them. He wanted one to become a man of letters, who becomes a judge. He wanted one to become a man of arms, who becomes a naval officer. And he wanted one to become a man of business, who is, I believe, the eldest and actually makes the most amount of money. This man, with this woman, Zoraida, who doesn't speak Spanish, so she doesn't understand what's going on. Apparently, while he was trapped, incarcerated in northern Africa, he once saw a beautiful hand of a woman who then dropped some gold to the ground and had some words said for him. And I'm sorry that I don't have a lot of time to go through this, through various mechanisms, it comes to be that he, in cahoots with a couple of his other slaves who want to make it back to Spain, and the desire of this girl Zoraida to go to a Christian land because she has found herself converted to Christianity secretly, he uses the money that she steals from her father in order to enlist a galley and then to take her with him. Some unforeseen things happen, like her father, Haji Murad, getting hip to this situation and being brought alongside her, and then figuring out that, in fact, she has betrayed him, which is not something that she had intended to do. She would have just disappeared with these slaves, and the assumption of her father would have been that she was stolen alongside them so that he could have at least rested comfortable in the delusion that she had not betrayed him. He loses that capacity. In any case, Zoraida wants to go with these Christian men to a Christian lady or a Christian land, where she will then take on the name Layla Maria, Mary, Queen of the Catholics, Queen of Heaven, as it were. Do I have anything interesting to say here? No, besides that. So after this soldier who has basically just gotten back to Spain with this Moorish woman who helped to relieve him of his incarceration, after they have come in, a judge comes in with a young lady named Doña Clara. Now, this is where things get really sticky. It turns out that this judge is in fact the brother of the naval captain who has just made his way from slavery back to Spain. The captain is at first, he thinks, well, I haven't really made much of myself. This guy's probably embarrassed. You know, he's a judge, and look, he's got this beautiful daughter with him. What? He probably doesn't want to know that I'm his brother. However, the priest tells the story of the captain to the judge. The judge says he would be honored to be related to such a person, and he is then reunited with his brother. Very interesting. Something else that happens during this time is that his daughter, Doña Clara, that is there with him, they hear later that night a shepherd singing outside. And in fact, this shepherd is one of the first that's not a female shepherd. It's actually a male shepherd. And this is itself a person in disguise, but a male in disguise as a male. Don Luis, again, another Don. Doña Clara, high-ranking. Don Fernando, Don Luis. And this Don Luis is in love with the daughter of the judge and wishes to marry with her. So you can see that these comic elements, these Shakespearean comic elements are coming up at the end for everybody except for our protagonist. Dorothea and Don Fernando find themselves together, Lucinda and Cardenio together, Zoraida and the captive, and then Doña Clara and Don Luis. But who is not with whom? Our poor Don Quixote is not with his Dulcinea. So all people are having their sort of their comic restitution moment, their moment of denouement, their moment of happiness, their moment of completion, whereas Don Quixote, like us, is left to witness these moments. In case, Maritornes also plays a terrible joke on Don Quixote just to make fun of him, that while he's outside guarding the castle, which is an inn, she locks his hand to the window so that if his horse Rocinante moves at all, he'll be pulled and basically put in terrible agony. And this does happen when several people approach the inn at the beginning of the next day, and Don Quixote speaks arrogantly to them. He is found outside while Maritornes and the daughter of the innkeeper are laughing, screaming because he is in so much pain. This is fairly typical for Don Quixote. This is the time at which we then are reintroduced to the barber, who comes by and claims that the helm of Mambrino that Don Quixote is wearing is in fact his basin, but is paid on the sly by the priest in order to keep quiet about this sort of thing. Okay, and this is also where he demands his pack saddle back, and those characters that are in on the lie with Don Quixote, Don Fernando, the love square, the priest, the barber, Sancho, and the innkeeper, all hold a different position from those who have just arrived in the inn, who are the Holy Brotherhood, who are not in on the joke. And so when there's a debate about whether a pack saddle is in fact a pack saddle, the people in the inn hold the view opposite from the people who are focusing on realism, which makes the Holy Brotherhood members think that the people in the inn are probably a little bit crazy, as it were. As things start to go down between the Holy Brotherhood and those people in the end, one of the members of it realizes this guy, he looks a little bit like who we have an arrest warrant for. And he looks at the arrest warrant and keeps looking at Don Quixote and looks at the arrest warrant and looks at Don Quixote, and you should think about that. You know how if you're going to a bar, a bouncer like kind of looks up, he gives you a hard look, maybe gives you a second look. It's like, well, maybe you don't look like your ID. But the description of Don Quixote and Don Quixote, there's nobody that looks like Don Quixote. And so the fact that he has to look down and look up and look down and look up, and it turns out that he says, oh, we have an arrest warrant for this individual. Don Quixote claims, how can there be an arrest warrant out for me? You are a low-born knave, and I am in fact the arm and law of the king. And so conflict breaks out. Sancho then attempts to reveal to Don Quixote that he has seen Dorotea making out with Don Fernando and acting in very unprincess-like ways with him, and that she may not be, in fact, Princess Metempsychosis. So even though Dorotea and Don Fernando have been reunited with each other, and they know that they have been, so have Cardenio and Lucinda, Don Quixote, because he was enmeshed in fighting Pandafilando in his room, the wineskins, at the time that they had their that they came back, that they had their moment of recognition, he still does not know. He's still not in the know about Princess Metempsychosis in fact being a fabrication that is made to lead him back. The priest and the barber, they come up with the idea to put Don Quixote in a cart and take him home. They're sort of tired of all of his hijinks. It's hard to get this guy to where he's going. It reminds me of a movie that had Russell Brand in it many years ago, where he was a rock star, and I believe it was Jonah Hill who was his sort of manager and had to get him to his shows. And Russell Brand's character made it very, very, very difficult for this to happen because he was such a chaotic force. Well, that force is similar to Don Quixote. All right. Don Quixote now finds himself in a cart, which he explains away to himself as some sort of enchantment. He has never known a knight to be in a cart. I can think of an example that contradicts his reading, however. There is in fact a story I believe it's by Chrétien de Troyes, the French chronicler of King Arthur, called The Knight in the Cart, where Lancelot is made to ride in a cart because Guinevere, Queen Guinevere, had demanded that of him. In fact, he does this against his own knightly honor, but she still holds it against him that he had to pause to think whether he would go in there or not. And so Don Quixote finds himself again in a unique situation that goes outside of the scope of the books that he has read. And so in order to make it make sense to himself, to make it intelligible to himself, he suggests to himself and to us that enchanters must have brought him into this cart. Though it's kind of odd because usually when knights are enchanted in books, they're absconded thousands of miles away, all in the flick of a wand, all at once. They seem to be teleported, and now he's moving pretty slowly. And so, again, this is something he's going to have to think about because there must be some explanation in his books. Okay, let's see. We then here meet 7 canons, and one of the canons, the canon of Toledo, engages in literary analysis with Don Quixote, suggesting that there is something pernicious about books. Something just to add to, and you might want to write about this, it's sort of a gross thing to write about, but sort of an interesting thing to write about, the physical comedy in this text. Do you know what I mean when I say physical comedy? Do any of you know what physical comedy is? It's where you use your body to make the joke. Like the trip in front of somebody, or this Gallagher, he used to take a mallet and destroy watermelons in front of people. Physical humor here is like vomiting or defecating on oneself. It's considered vulgar, low humor at times. And yet we've seen with the bomb of Fierabras, Sancho coming out of both ends and also vomiting on Don Quixote, while Don Quixote vomited on him. But now we also have a moment where Don Quixote is in a cart. He's locked in a cart at night. If you've never been incarcerated, you may have wondered, what do you do when you use the bathroom? Yeah, he has to do it where he happens to be. And so he actually has to relieve himself in the cart. And there's some question about, can you truly be enchanted if you don't? Do enchanted people relieve themselves? And this is a question that comes up in chapters 22 and 23 of part 2 when talking about the cave of Montesinos. It's enchanted people don't eat, they don't sleep, they don't seem to need money, though there is money present there. And yet Don Quixote finds that he has a need to relieve himself and does relieve himself. And so this is yet another instance of realism imposing itself on his fantasy. Recall that he's also needed money at times when he hasn't found that he had money. And he's also suffered, obviously, the evil effects of the violence that have been done to him by things like the Basque and the windmill, and this most recent scuffle with the Holy Brotherhood as well. All right. One thing that I should note here is that the canon holds the strong point that the deeds of knights errant never happened. This again makes, when Sancho hears this makes him question the sanity of his lord and master, Don Quixote. What does it mean that the deeds of knights errant never happened, though my lord and master is obviously a knight errant who has promised me this insula, which I think I will be getting at some point. There's a small agreement between the canon and Don Quixote that there are ennobling effects that come from reading chivalric romances. They enable great joy. They teach one about generosity, and they drive away melancholy. They can make one braver or gentler. Is this perhaps why we watch Marvel superhero movies or read comic books growing up? Perhaps not. Maybe playing certain video games. Don Quixote reveals that, in fact, he wants to become an emperor and to give Sancho an insula, even if he can't govern, even if he's not capable of it. Sancho, when he becomes ruler, will have to administer justice, and Sancho says he'll know how to govern just as soon as he is the governor, which is an interesting perception of his own. The canon, like many characters before, is very impressed by the lucidity of Don Quixote when talking about the role of leading and administering justice and being the Lord. However, it contrasts this with his notions that he is in fact a knight errant and that knight errants have existed in the past. And so his insanity and his lucidity are right next to each other. are placed side by side in such a way that it makes it difficult to understand who the person in front of the canon is and to interpret the level of ascending. He seems very intelligent, this Don Quixote, but also insane. So it's tough to know what to do with him in any case. She then gives a sort of misogynistic explanation of why a goat acts in the way, or we need a goat herd, and we hear how a goat has acted in sort of a typically female way as portrayed by the goat herd, and he says that is her natural instinct. And we get our final little story here, where we find another Anselmo, a goat herd. This is our last little wrinkle, our last thing that needs to be tied together. Apparently there was a goat herd named Anselmo, and this is not in the novel that was recklessly curious, the interpolated novel in part 1 of Don Quixote, chapters 33 to 35. But if he had fallen in love with a young lady, Leandra, and that things were looking good for him until a storyteller of sorts, who dressed in, who had 3 outfits, but managed to change the pieces on the outfit so many times that it looked like he had infinite, sort of an image of a clown or of someone who defrauds. And he told such beautiful stories that he managed to convince this Leandra to go off into the woods with him. He woos her away. He then leaves her in a cave without her chemise, like her shirt, her money, or her jewelry. And so here, right at the end, the chapter before the last of the end of part 1, which was to be the end entirely of this book, we see again a negative portrayal of the power of fictional stories and of storytellers. The ability of storytellers to come to town and to be very colorful, to tell a story, and then to leave a young woman ruined. One cannot help but think of stories from like the 70s of various rock bands traveling the world in the United States, like Led Zeppelin, and many stories that surround their malfeasance when they came to town. Any role traditionally where a performer of sorts travels around is traditionally considered a sort of vulgar job because of the role such individuals often play in the city and alongside the city's residents when they come to visit. There's an old prejudice against actors, singing performers, and though they don't perform per se, they do travel around to various ports. There's an old prejudice against sailors as well for this for similar reasons. In any case, this Eugenio and Anselmo, and remember that who were rivals for this Leandra, both lose out on her. And so what do they decide to do now that they have been afflicted by love and love lost? They decide to go out into the woods and to become what else but goat herd. So we see Marcella running from love, go out to become pastoral. We see also Don Luis, in order to follow his love, Doña Clara, become a goat herd. We see Dorothea afflict herself, done dirty, done wrong by Don Fernando, become a goat herd and go out into the wilderness. And yet we see this once again with this Eugenio and Anselmo. They're disconsolate, having lost the chance to be with Leandra. They decide to become shepherds. And many of their former lovers join them. In short, all despise her and all adore her. And she, of course, very similar to Lucinda, retreats to a convent. All right, the conclusion. Don Quixote claims that he would rescue Leandra from the convent, but a food fight breaks out instead, and a goat herd chokes Don Quixote as they wrestle and fight. As they fight, a clarion call from a trumpet is shot out, and Don Quixote asks to halt the current struggle. Catholic penitents are approaching, but Don Quixote thinks that they have captured a noble lady. These are individuals holding an icon of Mary, a picture of Mary, and he thinks that this is a noble lady. It's typical of his delusional thinking. There we go. During combat, Don Quixote falls and remains unmoving. In fact, he injures his shoulder, and he is placed back into the cart. Let's say he gets a shot and his shoulder is shattered. He is then returned to his village in his cart, and all are amazed. Sancho then returns to his wife, Teresa Panza. Notice also that sometimes she's called Maria Gutierrez. Sometimes she is called Teresa. That's something worth considering if you think about issues of identity and identification and transformation in this text and in a modernist context. But the compiler has no further information. We have nothing more from today than yellow. The third Sally, which would be the one that comes after this, and is in fact the one that comes after this, suggests that Don Quixote will go to the jousts at Saragossa. Something interesting about that is that because a second writer takes Don Quixote and takes the idea for that story and sends him to Saragossa to see the jousts, Cervantes, when he takes his pen back up in 10 years, really in 8 years, it takes him almost 2 years to finish the second part, but he writes it really fast. And really just before he dies, because he dies a year after he completes it, he makes it so that Don Quixote is about to go to Zaragoza, but instead takes a turn and goes to Barcelona instead, just as a way to show that the spurious writer of the second part who had written the story that was really Cervantes's to tell was an error about his very conception, about even the scope of his conception of what a second part of Don Quixote would be. And this, of course, allows Cervantes to use his characteristic wit and intelligence to subvert our expectations. Even though we are explicitly told that Don Quixote will go to Zaragoza at the end of part 1, he goes to Barcelona instead. And this, perhaps, is one of the major things that annoyed Cervantes about Don Quixote being used and appropriated by this Avellaneda for his spurious second part. He concludes with a sonnet, just as he began with several sonnets written by such dignitaries as Bucephalus and Rocinante, the horses. He concludes with a sonnet that says that Don Quixote and Sancho are buried next to each other, which is very sweet, but suggests what about these characters at the end of part 1? That they are, in fact, what? They're dead. And so what did this spurious writer of Avellaneda go and do with the characters of Cervantes? The opposite. He digs them up and brings them back to life. He's something of a necromancer. And so one thing, and we'll talk about this on Monday, that Cervantes goes great lengths to do is to extract his characters from Avellaneda, contradict Avellaneda at every turn. No, this didn't actually happen. No, this character, he'll have a character from Avellaneda's work enter into his own work, and then have Sancho and Don Quixote convince him that he was deluded to have thought that he actually met Sancho and Don Quixote in the other work. And so part of what Cervantes will do, besides subverting everything that was written by this Avellaneda, is he will take Don Quixote, he will kill him by the end of the second part, to make sure that every author knows that he's dead, and that only one author is allowed to write about Don Quixote, and that is his stepfather, Cervantes. All right. I actually made pretty good time on that. I'm pretty happy. And we have a minute or two left, but I think I am happy to let you go